The dust swirled thick in the town square of Cedar Ridge as folks gathered around the wooden platform. It was auction day, and the whole town turned out for the monthly event. Farmers needed workers, shopkeepers wanted help, and everyone came to see what deals they could strike. The sun beat down mercilessly on the crowd, making everyone squint and wipe sweat from their brows. Thomas McKenna stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered hands resting on his belt buckle. At 45, he had built one of the largest cattle ranches in 3 counties through hard work and fair dealing. His reputation preceded him wherever he went. People knew Tom McKenna as a man who kept his word and treated everyone with respect, regardless of their station in life. The auctioneer, a thin man named Jeremiah Watts, climbed onto the platform with a stack of papers. He wore a black suit that had seen better days and a hat that barely stayed on his balding head. The crowd pressed closer as he began calling out the first items for sale. Farm equipment, livestock, and household goods changed hands quickly as neighbors bid against each other. Then the mood shifted. Watts cleared his throat and announced that they would now be auctioning people bound to work contracts. This was legal in 1867, though it sat poorly with many folks who remembered the recent war. The first few people on the platform were men who owed debts or had committed minor crimes. They would work off their obligations and then be free. Crowd grew quieter when a young woman was brought forward. She was clearly of mixed heritage, with dark skin and striking features that spoke of both African and Native American ancestry. Her name was Sarah, though few in the crowd cared to learn. She stood straight and proud, despite her circumstances, her dark eyes scanning the faces before her without fear. Sarah had been born free in Kansas, but circumstances had forced her into this situation. Her family had died in a harsh winter, and she had taken on debts to survive. When she could not pay, the law allowed her labor to be sold to cover what she owed. It was a cruel system, but it was the reality of the time. The bidding started low. Most of the ranchers and farmers in the area were looking for strong men to work their land. They saw little value in a young woman, especially one whose heritage made her an outsider in their community. The bids came slowly, half-heartedly. As if the crowd was going through the motions, Tom McKenna watched from his spot at the back of the crowd. He had come to town for supplies, not to buy workers. His ranch ran smoothly with his current crew, and he prided himself on paying fair wages to free men who chose to work for him. But something about the young woman on the platform caught his attention. Maybe it was the way she held herself with dignity despite her situation. Maybe it was the flash of intelligence in her eyes as she looked over the crowd. Or maybe it was the uncomfortable silence that had fallen over the townspeople, as if they were ashamed of what they were witnessing. The auctioneer grew impatient as the bidding stalled. He called for higher bids, but the crowd remained largely silent. A few men made token offers, but their hearts were not in it. The whole scene had taken on an ugly feeling that made decent people want to look away. Tom found himself stepping forward. He had not planned to bid on anything, let alone participate in this particular auction. But something deep inside him rebelled against what he was seeing. This young woman deserved better than to be sold to the highest bidder like a piece of property. When the auctioneer called for $2, Tom's voice rang out clear and strong. The crowd turned to look at him in surprise. Thomas McKenna was known throughout the county, and his presence at the auction suddenly gave it more weight. People wondered what the respected rancher was up to. Other bidders seemed discouraged by Tom's entry into the proceedings. They knew he had money and influence, and few wanted to compete against him. The bidding continued for a few more rounds, but it was clear that Tom would win if he wanted to. At $2.50, Tom made his final bid. The auctioneer looked around for other offers, but the crowd had gone silent again. Some people seemed relieved that the uncomfortable situation would soon be over. Others whispered among themselves, wondering what McKenna planned to do with his purchase. Sarah watched the proceedings with growing unease. She had hoped someone decent might bid on her contract, but she knew nothing about this tall man in the worn cowboy hat. His face was weathered but kind, and his eyes seemed different from the others in the crowd. There was no calculation there. No assessment of her worth as property. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the auctioneer announced that Sarah's contract now belonged to Thomas McKenna. The crowd began to disperse, some people looking relieved, others curious about what would happen next. The whole auction had left a bad taste in everyone's mouth. Tom walked toward the platform as Sarah was led down by the sheriff's deputy. Up close, he could see that she was younger than he had first thought, probably no more than 22 or 23. She met his gaze directly, neither grateful nor resentful, just watchful. The paperwork was completed quickly. Tom paid the $2.50, and the deputy handed him the contract that made Sarah legally bound to work for him for the next 3 years. It was a document that made her little more than property in the eyes of the law, though Tom had already decided he would never see her that way. As they walked away from the platform together, Sarah finally spoke. Her voice was clear and educated, surprising Tom with its quality. She asked where they were going and what kind of work she would be expected to do. Her questions were practical, showing she understood her situation even as she maintained her dignity. Tom looked at her thoughtfully before answering, told her about his ranch, about the work that needed doing, and about the kind of life she could expect there. He spoke to her as he would speak to any person, with respect and honesty. It was clear that whatever happened next, Sarah's life was about to change in ways neither of them could imagine. The ride to McKenna's ranch took most of the afternoon. Sarah sat beside Tom on the wagon seat, watching the landscape change from dusty town streets to rolling grassland dotted with cattle. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was full of unspoken questions. Tom seemed lost in thought. While Sarah tried to understand what kind of man had bought her contract, the ranch house came into view as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon. It was larger than Sarah had expected, built of stone and timber with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Outbuildings scattered across the property spoke of a successful operation. Cowboys worked with horses in the corral. She could see cattle grazing in distant pastures. Tom brought the wagon to a stop near the front porch. Several ranch hands looked up from their work, curious about the woman their boss had brought. Home, Sarah could feel their eyes on her, some friendly, others uncertain. She had grown used to such looks over the years, people trying to figure out what she was and where she belonged. An older Mexican man approached the wagon with a smile. Tom introduced him as Miguel Santos, his foreman and oldest friend. Miguel had worked the ranch for 15 years, and Tom trusted him completely. The foreman tipped his hat to Sarah with genuine politeness, speaking to her in accented but perfect English. His welcome was warm, and Sarah felt some of her tension ease. Tom showed Sarah to a small but comfortable room in the house. It was clean and well-furnished, with a real bed, a washstand, and even a small mirror on the wall. She had expected to be housed with other workers in the bunkhouse, but Tom explained that he felt she deserved privacy and comfort. The gesture surprised her, though she tried not to show it. At dinner that evening, Tom laid out his expectations. Sarah would help with cooking, cleaning, and managing the household. She would also assist with ranch records, as Tom had noticed her education during their brief conversations. The work was honest and important, he told her, and he expected it to be done well. In return, he would provide her with good food, decent clothes, and respectful treatment. Sarah listened carefully to everything Tom said. His terms were far better than she had dared hope for, but she remained cautious. She had learned not to trust easily, even when people seemed kind. Too many promises had been broken in her short life, and she knew that circumstances could change. Quickly for someone in her position, the next morning Sarah began her duties. The previous housekeeper had left months earlier to get married, and the house showed signs of neglect. Sarah threw herself into the work, scrubbing floors, washing windows, and organizing rooms that had been ignored for too long. She found satisfaction in bringing order to the chaos, making the house feel like a proper home again. Tom watched her work with growing respect. Sarah approached every task with intelligence and care, figuring out efficient ways to get things done. She was clearly educated, and he found himself wondering about her background. During their conversations over meals, he learned that she could read and write better than most men in town, and she had a quick mind for numbers. The other ranch hands gradually warmed to Sarah's presence. Miguel had made it clear that she was to be treated with respect, and his word carried weight among the crew. Some of the younger cowboys were initially skeptical, but Sarah's competence and dignity won them over, never asked for special treatment, and carried her share of any work that needed doing. 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, Sarah proved her worth in an unexpected way. Tom had been struggling with his account books, trying to figure out why his expenses seemed higher than they should be. Sarah offered to look at the records, and within 2 days she had found several errors and identified places where money was being wasted. Her suggestions saved Tom hundreds of dollars and made the ranch more profitable. Despite her growing comfort at the ranch, Sarah remained aware of her legal status. She was not free to leave, not free to make her own choices about her life. The contract that bound her to Tom was always present in her mind, a reminder that her current situation, however pleasant, was temporary and beyond her control. Tom, for his part, found himself increasingly uncomfortable with the legal arrangement between them. He had bought Sarah's contract on impulse, driven by a desire to help rather than to acquire a worker. Now he was faced with the reality of owning another person's labor, and it sat poorly with his conscience. He had fought in the war partly over such issues, and owning a person's contract felt like a betrayal of those principles. One evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, Tom brought up the subject that had been bothering him. He told Sarah that he regretted buying her contract. Not because she was not a good worker, but because the whole system was wrong. No person should own another person's labor, he said, no matter what the law allowed. Sarah listened to his words with surprise and growing hope. She had sensed that Tom was different from other men who might have bought her contract. She had not expected him to question the legal arrangement so directly. His honesty about his discomfort gave her hope that her situation might not be permanent after all. The conversation that followed was the most honest they had shared since her arrival at the ranch. Tom asked about her background, her family, and how she had ended up in such circumstances. Sarah told him about her parents' death, her struggles to survive alone, and the debts that had led to her current situation. Her story was painful, but not self-pitying. It's told with the same dignity she brought to everything else. As the stars came out overhead, Tom made a decision that would change both their lives. He told Sarah that he intended to find a way to free her from the contract, despite what it had cost him. He did not want to own her labor, and he did not want her to feel trapped at his ranch. If she chose to stay and work for him after gaining her freedom, it would be her decision to make. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at Tom's words, though she fought to keep them back. No one had ever shown such consideration for her welfare, and his offer of freedom was more precious than gold. But she also knew that such things were easier said than done. The law was clear about work contracts, and breaking them could bring serious consequences for both of them that night. As Sarah lay in her comfortable bed, she allowed herself to dream of real freedom for the first time in months. Tom McKenna was proving to be a man of honor, but she knew that the road ahead would not be easy. Still, for the first time since her parents' death, she felt genuine hope for her future. The next morning brought unexpected visitors to the McKenna Ranch. Judge Harrison Caldwell arrived with 2 other men, all dressed in dark suits and wearing serious expressions. Tom met them on the front porch, his manner polite but cautious. He had known Judge Caldwell for years, and the man's presence at his ranch was unusual enough to cause concern. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as the men talked with Tom. She could not hear their words, but their body language told her this was not a social call. Judge Caldwell kept glancing toward the house, and one of the other men was taking notes in a small book. Her heart began to race as she realized they might be there because of her. The conversation on the porch grew more heated. Judge Caldwell's voice rose enough for Sarah to catch fragments of his words through the open window. He was talking about proper procedures, legal obligations, and community standards. Tom's responses were quieter but firm. Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. After 20 minutes, The visitors climbed back into their carriage and drove away. Tom stood on the porch for a long time, staring after them with a troubled expression. When he finally came inside, Sarah was waiting in the kitchen with fresh coffee and questions in her eyes. Tom sat down heavily at the kitchen table, accepted the coffee gratefully, explained that Judge Caldwell had received complaints about Sarah's treatment at the ranch. Some people in town were saying that Tom was being too lenient with a bound worker, that he was setting a bad example by treating her like a guest rather than property. The complaints had come from several prominent citizens, including banker Morrison and Mayor Blackwood. They argued that Tom's treatment of Sarah undermined the entire contract labor system. If word spread that workers could expect comfortable rooms and respectful treatment, it might encourage others to get into debt, deliberately knowing they would be well cared for. Sarah felt her heart sink as Tom continued his explanation. Judge Caldwell had not come to arrest anyone or break up the arrangement, but he had warned Tom to be more careful about appearances. The legal system depended on community support, and too much criticism could make life difficult for everyone involved. Tom looked directly at Sarah as he finished his account. He told her that the visit had not changed his mind about anything, but it had reminded him of the challenges they faced. Breaking her contract legally would require finding loopholes or technicalities that might not exist. Simply declaring her free could bring serious legal consequences for both of them. Despite the setback, life at the ranch continued much as before. Sarah maintained her duties with the same competence and dignity, while Tom continued to treat her as a valued member of his household rather than property. Miguel and the other ranch hands followed Tom's example, creating an atmosphere of respect that felt nothing like the typical master-servant relationship. 2 weeks after the judge's visit, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. Organizing Tom's papers, she found documents related to her contract that she had never seen before. Hidden among the legal language were clauses that neither she nor Tom had been told about during the auction. The contract contained provisions that would extend her period of service if certain conditions were met. Any illness that prevented her from working would add time to her obligation. Damage to property, even accidental, could result in additional months of service. Most troubling of all, the contract could be sold or transferred to another owner. Without her consent or knowledge, Sarah studied the documents carefully, her education allowing her to understand the legal implications that might have escaped someone with less learning. The contract was far more restrictive than either she or Tom had realized. She began to understand why Judge Caldwell and the others were so concerned about Tom's treatment of her. When she showed the documents to Tom that evening, his anger was immediate and intense. He had been deceived by the auctioneer and the legal officials who had processed the sale. The contract he thought he had signed was much different from the one that actually governed Sarah's situation. His jaw tightened as he read through the provisions. Understanding how thoroughly he had been manipulated, Tom's first impulse was to ride into town, confront the people who had deceived him. But Sarah, thinking more clearly, pointed out that such an approach would likely make things worse. The men who had structured the contract were powerful and well-connected. A direct challenge would probably result in Sarah being taken away from the ranch and sold to someone else. Perhaps someone who would not treat her well. Instead, Sarah suggested a different approach. She had noticed inconsistencies in the contract, language and dates that might provide grounds for legal challenge. If they could prove that the contract had been altered after the auction, or that proper procedures had not been followed, they might be able to void the entire agreement. Tom listened to Sarah's analysis with growing admiration for her intelligence and legal knowledge. She had identified several potential problems with the contract that might be exploited by a skilled lawyer. The question was whether they could find such a lawyer, willing to take on the powerful men who had created the situation. The conversation continued long into the night. Tom and Sarah discussed various strategies, weighing the risks and benefits of each approach. They both knew that any legal challenge would be dangerous, potentially making enemies of influential people in the community. But they also knew that Sarah's current situation was fundamentally unjust and needed to be addressed. As they talked, both began to realize that their relationship had evolved beyond the simple employer-worker dynamic that had brought them together. Tom had come to value Sarah's intelligence, integrity, companionship in ways that went far beyond her usefulness as a housekeeper. Sarah, in turn, had come to trust and respect Tom in ways she had never expected possible with any white man. In their society, the attraction between them was something neither was ready to acknowledge openly. The social barriers were too great and the legal complications too dangerous, but it existed nonetheless, adding another layer of complexity to their already difficult situation. The next morning brought news that would test their resolve. Miguel returned from town with word that banker Morrison was actively seeking to buy Sarah's contract from Tom. Morrison claimed that Tom was clearly unable to manage bound labor properly, that Sarah would be better served working in his household under proper supervision. Tom's refusal to sell would undoubtedly create more problems with the town's leadership. But there was never any question about his answer. Sarah was not property to be traded, and he would not allow her to fall into the hands of someone who would treat her as such. The battle lines were now clearly drawn, and Tom knew that the coming conflict would test everything he believed about justice and human dignity. 3 days later, Tom made a decision that shocked everyone in Cedar Ridge. He rode into town with Sarah beside him on the wagon seat, but this time he was not coming for supplies or business. Word had spread through the community that he had something important to announce. A curious crowd gathered in the town square. Tom climbed onto the same wooden platform where Sarah had been auctioned weeks earlier. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present, and murmurs rippled through the assembled townspeople. Banker Morrison and Mayor Blackwood stood near the front of the crowd, their faces showing displeasure at this unexpected development. Sarah remained on the wagon seat, her heart pounding as she watched Tom address the crowd. She had tried to talk him out of this public confrontation, arguing that it would only create more problems for both of them. But Tom had been determined to make his position clear to everyone in the community. Tom's voice carried clearly across the square as he began to speak. He told the crowd about the deception in Sarah's contract, the hidden clauses that had not been disclosed during the auction. He explained how the legal documents had been altered to create obligations that neither buyer nor seller had agreed to during the public sale. The crowd listened with growing tension as Tom detailed the problems with the contract. Many of the townspeople had not known about the complex legal provisions that governed such agreements. They had assumed that the auction process was straightforward and honest, not realizing how easily it could be manipulated by those who understood the system. Judge Caldwell stepped forward from the crowd, his face red with anger. He accused Tom of making false accusations against respected members of the community. The auction had been conducted properly, he insisted, and Tom was simply trying to avoid his legal obligations by creating imaginary problems with legitimate documents. Tom was ready for this challenge. He had brought copies of the contract documents, and he read aloud the specific clauses that had been hidden from view during the auction. He pointed out discrepancies in dates and signatures that suggested the documents had been altered after the sale was completed. The crowd began to take sides as the confrontation continued. Some people supported Tom, believing that he was exposing corruption in the legal system. Others sided with Judge Caldwell and the town leadership, arguing that Tom was undermining law and order for his own selfish purposes. Banker Morrison pushed his way forward, his face twisted with rage. He accused Tom of being a traitor to his own race and community. No decent white man would go to such lengths for a woman of mixed blood, he declared. Tom's behavior was scandalous and unacceptable in a civilized society. The banker's words hit Tom like a physical blow, not because they hurt him personally, but because they revealed the true nature of the opposition he faced. This was not really about contract law or proper procedures. It was about maintaining a social order that kept people like Sarah in their assigned place, regardless of their worth as human beings. Tom's response was quiet but devastating. He asked the crowd if they really wanted to live in a community where legal documents could be altered in secret, where auctions could be rigged to deceive honest buyers. He pointed out that such corruption could affect anyone, not just bound laborers like Sarah. Several voices from the crowd began to support Tom's position. Farmers and small business owners realized that they too could be victims of legal manipulation. If such practices were allowed to continue, The abstract question of Sarah's treatment became a concrete concern about their own vulnerability to corruption. Judge Caldwell tried to regain control of the situation by threatening Tom with legal action. He warned that continued resistance to lawful authority could result in serious consequences, including the possibility of criminal charges for interfering with legal contracts. Tom was unmoved by these threats. He announced that he intended to take the matter to the territorial court, where judges from outside the community could review the evidence without bias. He challenged anyone who opposed him to explain why they feared an honest legal review of the documents in question. The crowd began to disperse as the confrontation reached its climax. Some people left supporting Tom's position, while others remained loyal to the established leadership. The community was now clearly divided. Everyone knew that the conflict would not be resolved easily as Tom and Sarah prepared to leave town. Banker Morrison made one final attempt to assert his authority. He announced that he was still willing to buy Sarah's contract and that he would pay double what Tom had paid for it. This generous offer proved Tom's claims wrong, he argued. Since no one would pay so much for a troublesome worker, Tom's response was immediate and decisive. He reached into his wagon and pulled out his rifle, a Winchester that had served him. Well, for many years, the crowd fell silent as he walked back to the platform and laid the weapon at Sarah's feet. A gesture that stunned everyone present. The symbolism of the act was unmistakable. In frontier society, a man's rifle was his most precious possession, essential for survival and protection. By laying his rifle at Sarah's feet, Tom was making a public declaration that he valued her more than his own life, that he would rather be defenseless than see her treated as property. The gesture sent shockwaves through the crowd. Even Tom's supporters were surprised by such a dramatic display, while his opponents were rendered speechless by the implications. No one had expected him to go so far in defending Sarah's rights and dignity. Sarah stared at the rifle at her feet. Overwhelmed by the magnitude of Tom's gesture, she understood what it meant in their society, how it declared his feelings more clearly than any words could have done. Tears filled her eyes as she realized that this decent man was willing to risk everything for her freedom and honor. Banker Morrison recovered from his shock first, sputtering with rage at Tom's audacity. He declared that such behavior proved Tom was unfit to own any labor contract, and that the authorities would have to step in to protect community standards. Tom ignored the banker's threats as he helped Sarah down from the wagon. He picked up his rifle and walked beside her toward their wagon, his head held high, despite the mixed reactions from the crowd. They had made their position clear to everyone in Cedar Ridge, and now they would have to live with the consequences of their bold stand. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Both Tom and Sarah lost in their own thoughts about what had just happened. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, making their relationship public in a way that would bring both support and condemnation. The battle for Sarah's freedom had become something much larger, a struggle that would test the values of their entire community. The weeks following Tom's dramatic gesture in the town square brought unexpected consequences for everyone involved. Word of the confrontation spread far beyond Cedar Ridge, carried by travelers and merchants to other communities throughout the territory. Some people praised Tom's stand for justice and human dignity, while others condemned him as a dangerous radical who threatened social order. Support came from surprising quarters. A lawyer named Daniel Foster arrived from the territorial capital, having heard about the case from a newspaper report. Foster was young but experienced in contract law, and he believed that Sarah's situation represented a clear case of legal fraud that needed to be challenged in court. Foster spent 3 days at the ranch, reviewing all the documents related to Sarah's contract. His analysis confirmed what Tom and Sarah had suspected. The auction documents had been altered after the sale, with additional clauses inserted to make the contract more restrictive and profitable for those who controlled it. More importantly, Foster discovered that similar alterations had been made. 2 other labor contracts sold in Cedar Ridge over the past 2 years. The pattern of fraud was extensive, involving dozens of workers who had been deceived about the true terms of their obligations. The The corruption went far deeper than anyone had imagined. Armed with this evidence, Foster filed formal complaints with the territorial court, challenging not just Sarah's contract, but the entire system of contract auctions in Cedar Ridge. He argued that the fraudulent practices had created a form of illegal slavery that violated both territorial and federal law. The legal challenge sent shockwaves through the town's establishment. Judge Caldwell, Banker Morrison, and Mayor Blackwood found themselves under investigation for their roles in the fraudulent contract system. Federal marshals arrived to secure documents and interview witnesses, treating the matter as a serious criminal case. Tom and Sarah watched these developments with a mixture of hope and anxiety. The legal process was moving in their favor, but they knew that powerful enemies would not give up without a fight. Both had received anonymous threats, warning them to drop their challenge or face severe consequences. The threats became reality one night when riders attacked the ranch. Tom and his crew fought them off, but several buildings were damaged by fire and some of the cattle were scattered. No one was seriously injured, but the message was clear. Those who challenged the established order would pay a price for their defiance. Sarah was shaken by the attack, not because she feared for herself, but because she could not bear the thought of Tom and his men suffering for her sake. She offered to leave the ranch and disappear, thinking that her absence might end the conflict and protect the people she had come to care about. Tom refused to even consider her suggestion. He reminded her that this was no longer just about her situation, but about justice for all the workers who had been cheated by the corrupt contract system. Running away would abandon those people and allow them as criminals to continue their practices with impunity. Miguel and the other ranch hands supported Tom's position, despite the danger it brought to them. They'd come to respect Sarah and believe in the justice of her cause. More than that, they understood that corruption in the legal system threatened everyone's rights and freedoms. As the legal proceedings continued, public opinion began to shift in Tom and Sarah's favor. The evidence of widespread fraud was overwhelming, and even some of the town's prominent citizens began to distance themselves from the corrupt officials. The territorial governor publicly promised a thorough investigation and prosecution of all wrongdoers. The breakthrough came when one of the minor officials involved in the fraud decided to cooperate with the federal investigation. Facing serious criminal charges, he provided detailed testimony about how the contract auction system had been manipulated for years to enrich a small group of powerful men. His testimony revealed that Sarah's case was just one example of a systematic scheme to defraud both buyers and workers in the contract labor market. The conspirators had made substantial profits by creating fake obligations and extending contract terms through hidden clauses and fraudulent documentation. Judge Caldwell was arrested on charges of corruption and conspiracy, ending his long career of respected service to the community. Banker Morrison fled town rather than face prosecution, abandoning his business and leaving his family to deal with the scandal. Mayor Blackwood resigned in disgrace, though he avoided criminal charges by cooperating with investigators. With the corruption exposed and the criminals facing justice, Sarah's legal situation changed dramatically. The territorial court ruled that her contract was null and void, having been based on fraudulent documentation and illegal practices. She was immediately declared free of all obligations and entitled to compensation for the injustices she had suffered. The court's decision was celebrated throughout the territory as a victory for justice and the rule of law. Sarah became something of a celebrity, praised in newspapers as a brave woman who had stood up to corruption and won her freedom through courage and intelligence. But she was no longer bound to work for Tom, and some people expected her to leave the ranch and make her own way in the world. The question of what she would do next became a subject of intense speculation throughout the community. Tom, for his part, found himself in an awkward position. His feelings for Sarah had grown stronger during their ordeal, but the social barriers between them remained as formidable as ever. Even as a free woman, Sarah would face prejudice and discrimination that would make any relationship between them extremely difficult. Sarah wrestled with her own emotions as she considered her options. She was grateful to Tom for everything he had done, but she did not want him to feel obligated to continue supporting her now that she was free. She had job offers from other communities and the resources to start a new life anywhere she chose. The decision about her future weighed heavily on both of them as they tried to navigate their changed relationship. They had been through so much together, fought so hard for justice and freedom, but now they had to figure out what came next. The battle for Sarah's legal freedom was over, but the battle for their personal happiness was just beginning. Late one evening, as they sat on the ranch porch watching the sunset, Sarah finally found the courage to speak about what was in her heart. She told Tom that she loved him, not out of gratitude for what he had done, but because of who he was as a man. She also told him that she would leave if he thought it would be better for both of them. Tom's response was everything she had hoped for and feared to expect. He told her that he loved her too, had loved her for weeks, but had not dared to say. So, he asked her to stay, not as his employee or his obligation, but as his partner and companion for whatever challenges lay ahead. The decision to marry was not made lightly by either Tom or Sarah. They both understood the challenges they would face as an interracial couple in 1867 America. Even in the territories where attitudes were sometimes more flexible than in the established states, their union would face criticism and legal obstacles. Daniel Foster, the young lawyer who had helped win Sarah's freedom, agreed to research the legal requirements for their marriage. The territorial laws were complex, with different rules applying to different racial combinations. Mixed marriages between whites and Native Americans were sometimes permitted, while those between whites and African Americans were generally forbidden. Sarah's mixed heritage created a legal gray area that Foster hoped to exploit if he could. Established that she was primarily of Native American ancestry, the marriage might be legally recognized. It would require careful documentation and possibly testimony from people who had known her family. While Foster worked on the legal challenges, Tom and Sarah faced social pressures from the community. Some of Tom's longtime friends and neighbors expressed disappointment in his decision, arguing that he was throwing away his reputation for a relationship that could never be accepted by decent society. Other members of the community, however, rallied to support the couple. The corruption scandal had changed many people's attitudes about justice and fairness. Those who had seen Sarah's courage and intelligence during the legal battle were more willing to accept her as Tom's chosen partner. Miguel Santos became one of their strongest supporters, using his influence among the Mexican and Native American workers in the area to build a network of allies. He reminded everyone that Tom had always treated all people with fairness and respect, regardless of their background, and deserved the same treatment in return. The breakthrough came when Foster discovered an elderly Cheyenne woman named White Dove, who had known Sarah's grandmother. White Dove testified that Sarah's maternal grandmother had been a full-blooded Cheyenne who had married a freed slave after the Indian Wars. This testimony established Sarah's Native American heritage more clearly than any written documentation could have done. Armed with this evidence, Foster petitioned the territorial court for permission for Tom and Sarah to marry. The judge who heard the case was new to the territory, having been appointed after the corruption scandal. He was determined to show that the territorial courts would uphold justice and the rule of law without prejudice. The judge ruled that Sarah's Native American ancestry made her eligible to marry a white man under territorial law. The decision was controversial, but it was legally sound and difficult to challenge. Tom and Sarah would be permitted to marry, making their union one of the first legally recognized interracial marriages in the territory. The wedding took place on a beautiful autumn day, with golden leaves falling around the ranch house like nature's confetti. The ceremony was performed by a traveling minister who had known Tom's family for years. Despite the controversy, nearly 100 people attended, including ranch hands, townspeople, members of the local Native American community. Sarah wore a dress that had belonged to Tom's mother, altered to fit her perfectly by the wife of one of the ranch hands. The simple white gown transformed her into a radiant bride, her dark eyes shining with happiness as she walked toward the man who had risked everything for her freedom and love. Tom waited for her in his best suit, his weathered hands steady as he took her arm. The minister spoke about love, courage, and the power of two people to change the world by standing together against injustice. The words seemed especially meaningful given everything the couple had endured to reach this moment, when they exchanged vows. Both Tom and Sarah spoke from their hearts rather than from a prepared text. Tom promised to love and protect Sarah, for all his days to stand by her against any opposition they might face. Sarah promised to be his partner in all things, to build a life together based on mutual respect and shared values. The reception that followed was a celebration that brought together people from many different backgrounds. Cowboys danced with townswomen, Mexican musicians played alongside a fiddler from town, and Native American friends shared traditional foods with their new neighbors. The party continued until well after midnight, joyous affirmation of love conquering prejudice, as the guests finally departed and the newlyweds found themselves alone. Tom and Sarah reflected on the long journey that had brought them together. What had begun with a $2 purchase at a public auction had become a love story that challenged social conventions and changed lives throughout their community. The months that followed brought both happiness and continued challenges. Some people in the territory never accepted their marriage, but others came to see Tom and Sarah as an example of how love could bridge differences and create something beautiful. Their ranch became a gathering place for people of all backgrounds, who believed in justice and human dignity. Sarah threw herself into making the ranch a true home, using her intelligence and education to help Tom expand his business and influence. In the community, she established a small school for the children of ranch workers, teaching reading and writing to youngsters who might never have had such opportunities otherwise. Tom found that his marriage to Sarah had cost him some old friendships, but had gained him new ones that were based on deeper values. The men who worked for him respected Sarah as much as they respected him, and the ranch became known throughout the territory as a place where all people were treated fairly. 1 year after their wedding, Sarah gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Hope. The little girl was a symbol of their belief in a future where love could overcome hatred, where justice could triumph over corruption, and where two people who had found each other against all odds could build something lasting and beautiful together. Their story became legend in the territory, told and retold around campfires and dinner tables as an example of what was possible. When good people refused to accept injustice, the rancher who had paid $2 for a woman's labor contract had gained something far more valuable than he could ever have imagined: a partner, a love, and a family that would endure long after. The prejudices of their time had faded into history.